Welcome to On Becoming a Healer. My co-host, Stefan Kertez, is off today, so it's just me. I just want to start by saying that we receive a lot of requests for interviews from authors, and most of the time when I look at samples of the writing, I feel like it's just not quite what we're looking for or what our audience would appreciate. But that's not what happened when I was sent an excerpt from our guest's book, The Temple Road, A Doctor's Journey, which is a memoir by the retired oncologist, Fazlur Rahman. I expected to skim a few chapters, and instead, I found myself reading the entire book almost at one sitting, and then immediately discovering that he had a second book called Our Connected Lives, Caring for Cancer Patients in Rural Texas, and hungrily getting that one off of Amazon and then reading that book as well. And by the time I was finished with both books, I felt like you can see I'm already calling him by his first name. I felt like Fazlur was an old friend, and we had not yet met. The first book is the story of his childhood, growing up in what is now Bangladesh. The book begins with his losing his mother in childbirth when he's a 7-year-old child. It takes us through his years in a country that was somewhat in turmoil at the time. It was still East Pakistan. And eventually he comes to the United States, which is sort of where the first book ends. And then he ends up training on the East Coast and then moving out to Texas, becoming an oncologist, and then spending 4 decades in a rural Texas community as a cancer doctor, where he becomes a beloved figure. And the second book, Our Connected Lives, is really about a small group of patients who he singled out to kind of give us an in-depth look at what it was like to take care of patients in this particular setting. So, in addition to being a rural oncologist, Fazlur is someone who loves writing and loves reading. In fact, one of the things that comes out in his first memoir is that he was struggling between becoming a poet and a doctor. And obviously in the community he was in, there was a lot of pressure to become a doctor. And fortunately for all of us, that's what he chose to do. But the poet inside of him comes out very clearly in his writing. And in addition, I should say that over the years, he's published essays in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Review, and other really widely read and widely respected publications. These two books, from my view, aren't really about cancer. They're really about seeing people and about being present with them. And I can't think of anyone who better embodies what we mean when we talk about becoming a healer or being a healer. So it's a privilege to welcome Fazlur Rahman to the podcast. Welcome, Fazlur.
Thank you, Saul, for having me and for your kind words.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I think one of the challenges of interviewing you, and I got this sense from the first time we talked, is that you are so sort of soft-spoken and modest in person that I feel like I'm going to have to pull it out of you so everybody can learn a little bit more about your life. But that's what we're going to do here. And I want to begin by reading one of my favorite excerpts. It's from chapter 3 of The Temple Road, and it's actually called The Temple Road. It's the eponymous chapter of the book. And just for background, you grew up in an extraordinarily poor setting on the really actually very near India, on the west coast of what is now Bangladesh, in a small rural community. And as I mentioned, your mother died in childbirth when you were very young. And in this particular chapter, you open by describing the 2-mile journey, the 2-mile walk that you took every day to school along a winding path. And so I'll begin right there. The 2-mile walk from my village to the school in Benapole town zigzagged through forests and jungles. In between, farmlands dotted the landscape. This country path was anything but ordinary. Its dangers were real, and yet it enchanted me because it passed by the Hare Krishna temple, the Hare Krishna whose characters and myths affected me in my early years. One walks many paths in a lifetime, but one remembers a particular path the most. For me, it is the Temple Road, as the path was known. Why would a Muslim boy from a Mullah family be attracted to a Hindu shrine? It's not easy to explain. The Temple Road was dark in places, even during daytime, because the thick canopy blocked the sunlight. The noon hours mirrored the dusk, as if the sky was overcast with clouds. We were afraid of walking alone on the path, so the village boys and I went to school together. In my mind, wild animals, ghosts, and apparitions were ever present there. But the wild boars and cobras were not in my imagination. Cobras did not strike unless we surprised them. Not so with boars. They were ubiquitous in the jungles and attacked anyone in their way, Their sharp tusks tore apart an unwary victim in seconds. Once, my friends and I saw a group of boar hunters, the Kaurus, on the road carrying a dead comrade, bloody and shredded into pieces, the work of an angry boar. Terrified, we ran from them until we were breathless. In the winter months, Bengal tigers were another menace. Though none of us had yet been attacked by a tiger, the big cats never left my thoughts on my way to school. One thing that blunted my fear was the beauty of the landscape. Mustard flowers in bloom spread their golden colors, and the rice fields before harvest danced in the winds. In the spring and summer, wildflowers gave a dazzling show. The Beli, Kameli, Kamini, Pulash, Shimul, among others. Bangladesh, formerly East Pakistan, has 6 seasons: summer, monsoon, autumn, late autumn, winter, and spring, and each has its own flowers. Even the lakes, marshes, and ponds were rich in colors with lotuses, water lilies, and water hyacinths. With the abundant rain and fertile soil of a tropical land, flowering plants and trees grew everywhere. So Fazlur, as I said, you grew up in extraordinary poverty. You lost your mother when you were young, and you lived among these different religions, and eventually found yourself caring for cancer patients in rural Texas. So looking back, what do you see as the thread connecting those seemingly unrelated chapters?
We go through a lot of traumas in our lives as we grow up, and luckily most of them minor, but some of them stays etched in your memory. And my mother's death is one of them that a 7-year-old boy can remember more than you think. So her death really affected me a great deal, and that stayed in my memory. And the second, my mother used to say that someday you will be a doctor and save lives and help people. The reason she said that, she had seen a lot of death among children, adults, in epidemics, cholera, malaria, smallpox, Kala-Azar, and all those things. But here your mother wanted you to be something or become something, and then she suddenly died. That stays in my memory. So that's when I became a doctor, and remember that I have been through all those things. Plus, I had my own Kala-Azar, almost died after my mother died. So those things seep into your mind as time goes, and then you feel like that you see a sick person, then, I've been through that, so this person is the same age as I was. Again, I need to tell you ahead of time that I have my share of failings, so I'm no better or no worse than any other doctor. But certainly those growing up the way I did, perhaps my sensitivity was a little different. That's all I could explain to you. So those are the connections between the...
One of the things that I notice in your writing is how attentive you are to nature. And for example, in the passage I just read, you notice all of the flowers and you remember them by name. And when you think back many, many years as you wrote the memoir, you remember them. And this is pervasive throughout both of your books, your attentiveness to nature. And I'll get to that more, particularly in the context of patient care when you become an oncologist and you make house calls and you describe the natural setting. And often when I read books, there's kind of a scene setting where the author describes nature and then kind of digs into what they really want to write about, which is the people. But for you, I had the sense that you were just describing life as you experienced it and this sort of hyper-awareness of the natural world. And I'm curious, first of all, where that came from, and secondly, how you think that connects to your way of practicing medicine.
That's a good question. I'm not sure there's an easy answer, but remember that we are talking about when I grew up 70, 75, 60 years ago. And at that time, what is now Bangladesh, a smaller number of population, just like in the US. And the second is that at that time, the whole place was forested in between the villages and the fields and all that, just like I wrote. So nature was everywhere. That is the flowers and the birds and the forest and the trees, and the colors. And then, a lot of songbirds also at that time. And those things are gone now. So all those things seep into your mind. And plus, some of those wild animals I was talking about, they are real too. If you have forested area, you have a lot of waters, lakes, rivers, marshes, you're going to have wildlife. So that's why the nature seeped into me. And as I grew up, I still like that. I love to go to see wildflowers. My wife and I, her name is Ara, A-R-A, full name is Jahanara, Jahanara. We both love nature, but it started from that beginning, the way I grew up, saw all those things. Plus, I think what happened is that there is another reason I kind of think now also for quite a while, because I was a sickly child. So I loved books, and I was sickly, and my brother was very healthy, like any other boy in the village, played and all sorts, ran around here and there. I couldn't do that. I stayed mostly close to my mother because of sickness, and my mother wanted that way too. So you notice all around things around you, you have to keep your mind occupied. Either you read or you look around, and then kind of like I told you, it kind of seeped into my mind.
As I said, I saw this part of you in your interactions with many of your patients, and one that stands out for me is your relationship with a woman you call Clara, who you met when she was 39 years old. This is, of course, in Texas, where you had been practicing for some time. And she turned out to have widely metastatic multiple myeloma. First of all, I just have to comment on the isolation you experienced as an oncologist in those days, where there was really no other oncologist, no cancer doctor around for 200 miles. And you even described looking at the slides yourself and seeing that she has myeloma. Clara had 2 children, a husband, Mark, who worked in the oil field. She'd been a teacher before she had children herself. And unfortunately, at that stage, multiple myeloma was an incurable cancer with a rather poor life expectancy. It apparently was about 2 years, and in her case, it was thought to be potentially much shorter. But that's not, in fact, what happens to her. She has an extraordinarily unusual course, and in fact, you run into her 23 years later, alive and well. And I remember that section where she teases you with, "It's the real me, not my ghost," when you see her. I shouldn't say you hadn't seen her for that full 23 years, but because you did play a critical role in getting her through some remission, some relapses. But again, an extraordinary story. Anyway, there's this moment in your long relationship with her when you kind of need to kick her off of hospice. She'd been in hospice and she liked it. She was getting great services, but you had a responsibility to make sure that federal dollars were used appropriately. And so you got into this kind of tense situation with her where you were trying to get her off of hospice, and the nurses in hospice were urging you on. And there's this one scene where you go to her house to have a heart-to-heart conversation with her. And I just actually want to read the passage because I think it's kind of characteristic of a lot of them in terms of your connection to nature and just sort of how that struck me. You write, "I went to her home to talk. She greeted me warmly and asked me to sit at her dining table. Then she went to get me a cup of tea. She knew I enjoyed hot tea. While waiting, I looked through a window. It was a bright afternoon, and birds were singing in the oaks. Songbirds always made me happy. She had bird feeders outside the window, and several white wings were jostling each other and eating the seeds. I was surprised to see them. They were mostly South Texas doves that had begun to migrate to West Texas. There was a garden next to a glass panel where a pair of hummingbirds fluttered for nectar. Their feathers flashed in a beam of sunlight as they zoomed back and forth, proving that hummingbirds are the only birds that can fly forwards and backwards and hover. A thought crossed my mind. Why was I here to spoil a day like this for Clara and me? They're lovely, don't you think? Clara startled me. I hadn't heard her light footsteps. They sure are, I replied. She put the cup on the table and pulled up a chair in front of me. I glanced at her as I drank. It dawned on me that I'd been so preoccupied with relieving her illness that I'd forgotten the person herself. Her moon face and buffalo humps were almost gone, and most of her old glow had returned. With her combed hair, she had little hair loss from the melphalan, and stylish blouse and skirt, she looked beautiful, and she moved around easily before she sat. She thanked me for coming to check on her, and there was a wide smile on her face. After a few pleasantries, I forced myself to delve into the heart of the issue. Otherwise, I was afraid I might leave without fulfilling my intended obligation. We can't ignore the rules at will, Clara, I said. We need to cut off the hospice. You're doing well. I don't care about your rules, she retorted, her arms folded defiantly. I'm alive because of them, am I not? Her face stiffened, her smile fading. We were at a stalemate again. We'll discuss it another time with Mark and you together, I said, and got up to leave. I can decide for myself. Mark has enough on his shoulders. He works long hours. We have bills to pay. So, Tell me about that moment with the hummingbird. Most people would be worrying, at least I would be worrying about, what am I going to say to Clara? And instead, you were absorbed watching that bird.
So I did worry about what I'm going to tell, but just happened to see through the window. Even I have an office, it's a smaller window in the back. I would always, sometimes, not always, sometimes I'll look through the window if there is anything. But I knew she wouldn't be easy to dislodge from her opinion because she was very opinionated. She was a good person, but very opinionated. And you've seen that kind of person. Some of us like that too. So when I saw that, that's when it dawned on me, really, I'm going to have probably not easy time with her. Why should I spoil my day and her day, and she's in such a good mood now. While at the same time, I have to figure out a way to put my words that I came here for that purpose. So your question, yes. Why did I say that? Because I happened to notice it. I couldn't help it. That was just kind of habit,
One thing that struck me about this relationship and many others you describe is how you didn't use your power in the way that you might have. You could have just cut her off. And instead, that's not what you did. You went and you negotiated with her. You argued with her. Pretty much kind of on a level playing field. Of course, you had the power just to stop. And one of the things that struck me about that is because so often doctors exercise their power over their patients. And you came from a culture, and you described this in your book, that was extremely hierarchical, where when physicians walked into a room, the nurses stood up. And of course, you describe how when you came to New York, that was not the case anymore. And yet, to me, you seem in your relationship with patients to be incredibly egalitarian, far more so, I would say, than even American physicians typically are. And I'm curious about how you made that change, sort of from the culture from which you came to the kind of way in which you chose to practice medicine. And I guess my second part of the question is why didn't you just cut her off?
That's a good question. Remember that I could have cut her off. The reason I didn't cut her off is simply because, remember I told you when I was a 7-year-old, right after my mother died, I had Kala-azar, of which I almost died. I still, I remembered that the doctor looked at my father, not at me, because I guess I was a little kid, I didn't count, And those things, again, I told you, seeped into my mind. So when I became a doctor, especially an oncologist, a cancer doctor, and as you know, it can be frustrating. You see the same patient again and again and again, and you hear the same complaint, nausea, vomiting, weakness, and all that, And they are not making it up. Every time you chemo, you make them sick. They get a little better, you make them sick. So I thought through those things, that if I were that patient, what would happen? And then I had a teacher, Professor S.M. Robb, and he told me that, your healing begins with your empathy and your reassuring presence at the patient bedside. In the beginning, I had a hard time, Saul. I really did, because I said, what difference I am making. Remember that when I started practice 75, that's 51 or so years ago, mortality rate in cancer was very high. And we did not have good pain control. And we didn't have good nausea medicine. You used very high dose Reglan, chloroquine, then that also caused extrapyramidal symptoms, and you have to give Benadryl to this. So all those things also bothered me, these people going through so much. And if I add additional burden, what good I am doing to them. That probably some of those thinking together, I never tried to, I had obviously some patients I had to, I read your book, on Becoming a Healer. It's a really good book, that you have to know your boundary too. You engage, at the same time you do your boundary. And I think that's the word I didn't use it, I should have, but I had to sometimes use the boundary, Otherwise, you'll not be able to function every day. So I did use sometimes the boundary, but most of the time I let the patients have their say.
I remember the account of your Kala-azar very vividly. That was a very tough time in your life. Your mother had died and your father kind of fell apart and emotionally. And you were struggling financially and you were somewhat lonely. And you were struggling in school, although at the same time you were also an extremely good student. You worked very, very hard. As you said, you were kind of sickly but determined. And then when you got this Kala-Azar, this disease. It took a while for them to diagnose it. You ended up going to a variety of different healers. But the one you described, the physician you described, was actually not a physician. He was somebody who practiced like a physician. He practiced with a physician, but he was really domineering. I think what you were able to do is learn from negative role models as well as positive role models. So when you had these negative experiences as a child with Kala-Azar, and you were treated in ways that became puzzling to you, like, why is this man so insistent on being paid? Even though I'm a child, why doesn't he talk directly to me? Why is he so harsh? And so I think from those experiences, you learned how not to be when it became your turn to be in the role of having the power as a physician.
I guess I have to agree with you, both negative and positive. And over time, again, you glean from one under the other, and then kind of things stick to you that you think that you like, or your mind likes, or your thinking likes, So yes, both negative and positive.
So once you had come to the United States and trained, starting in New York and then moving out to Texas, it was time to look for a job. And you describe a series of attempts to get a job that were marred by, I guess, what I would call racism. And we'll talk more about that. You would get very close to getting hired, and then somebody, the board would discover that you were a dark-skinned man from another place, and they would say, no, thanks, you're not a good fit. And that happened a few times. And eventually, you end up in San Angelo. I want to just read the reaction that you got about moving to this area. All of my oncology classmates chose to settle in large cities, such as Houston, Dallas, and Phoenix. When I told my colleagues I was going to San Angelo, they first asked me where the place was. Hearing that it was in West Texas, a few said, why do you want to go to the boondocks? There's nothing there except oil fields and roughnecks. How wrong they were. As I look back, I'm glad I chose San Angelo. The kind of intimacy that I developed with my patients and their loved ones would have been difficult in big cities. My family and I became part of the community, and its people became a part of me. Their welfare mattered to me beyond medicine. I believed that all this, in addition to my own suffering, in my growing up years, made me a better doctor. And then later you say, upon my retirement in 2011, this is decades later, the San Angelo Standard-Times ran a front-page story about me, headlined, Doctor Retires with Love and Respect. If I was awarded love and respect, what more reward could I ask for? It was the simplicity and generosity of the rural small-town people that bestowed me with these sentiments, despite my failings. Sure, I had to deal with my share of individuals who didn't care for black or brown-skinned persons, doctor or not, but they were overshadowed by the vast number of good-hearted souls. Now, first of all, I have to tell you, reading about your life and your work in this community, I felt some envy. I've had the other side of the coin, the academic, urban experience, but quite honestly, the life that you led as for many years, the sole oncologist, caring for people in the community, giving them your home phone number, they would call you when anything happened, you would jump in your car and rush to the hospital, or in some cases go to their home, how your life was intertwined with theirs, how you'd be the one to go put their blood on a slide and look at it, and how all the other doctors in the community came to rely on you to care for their cancer patients. On the one hand, it sounds exhausting and unrelenting and unforgiving. The responsibility was extraordinary. But wow, what a way to practice medicine. And I'm just wondering if you think that is still possible today.
No, I don't think it's possible because, there was a survey, I think 2 or 3 years ago, said 72% of the people are unhappy with their doctors because they don't pay attention, they don't take time. The hospitals and practices has become extremely profit-oriented. I am for profit. Money has to come somewhere to grow, buy new equipment, buy MRI scan, PET scan, and all that. There was a health expert years ago, maybe 30 years ago or more. He wrote a series of articles in the New England Journal of Medicine. And he said that the Hospital Corporation of America, that was the biggest hospital chain in the country at that time. He said these big hospital chains are necessary, okay? So they can cut cost and make it more efficient, this and that. It didn't work out that way, actually. And what do you think happened to HCA? ACA got severely punished by Medicare because they did some medical fraud, I think in Florida somewhere, and they forced them to break into three pieces. And one of them, became ours. So, idea that having a big hospital chain make it efficient doesn't work. It's inefficient. They have too many administrators. They forget about patients. They're only interested in profit motive. I don't know how long we can do that, Like yesterday, my wife was going through a whole bunch of calls here and there just for a mammogram. Why? We didn't have that kind of thing before, that is in Houston, from here. So we need to make it more patient-oriented rather than administration-oriented. And secondly, we need profit, but not excess profit. That's what causes a lot of these problems, I think, excess profit. So that is the reason. I think that become very profit motivated and patients come out secondary,
Now, one thing that struck me about your perspective as a physician in these years is that on the one hand, you were writing editorials that were making it into the New England Journal of Medicine, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal about how medicine was turning into a business. You wrote a piece that was very influential back in the 1980s on the RVU system, the relative value unit system. You wrote a major editorial on the need for a hospice movement, and which, by the way, I think is an extraordinary testament to your writing, because I can tell you from personal experience, nothing I ever write gets accepted by the New York Times, by the Wall Street Journal.
I'm just lucky.
And it wasn't lucky, because you did it over and over again. And you were a nobody to them. Like, they didn't even know who you were, and they still published your stuff. I can't tell you how unusual that is, because you're a very gifted writer. So on the one hand, you were looking at these big picture issues as you are now. But at the same time, when I read your work, your life was deeply intertwined with the life of your patients in a very deep way. And again, going back to Clara, and I could pick any patient. You write, in later years, I thought of Clara on and off. She deepened my knowledge of human connection and partnership. Moreover, how I dealt with my patients and how I interacted with them, especially in their most vulnerable moments, made a difference in their recovery and in my success and failure as their physician. These lessons were equally useful in navigating my daily life, grappling with my own adversities and those of loved ones. Clara reinforced in my mind the value of hope and resilience in the face of bleakness. And again, this is a woman who is in some ways pretty difficult, who you argued with. And again, I see that in a lot of your relationships with patients, that you were constantly growing, you were constantly questioning yourself, and you were making yourself vulnerable to them, which now enabled you to learn from the experiences as a person. And I'm wondering, first of all, if you think if that's still possible. Has the for-profit system made that impossible? Is it still possible? Can you still practice that way?
I'm not saying dismantle everything, but our thinking have to change. All these fancy buildings in the hospital, this and that. We're very interested in having very expensive PET scan and claim that we are the first one in the town. Sometimes hospitals believe their own advertisement. That's what really worries me most. They do.
And you established, when you came, you were the only oncologist. And then, as you said, you established a multi-specialty group with your colleagues from other areas of medicine, from surgery and primary care and pediatrics and so forth. And then, but you were the only oncologist for quite a while, I believe. But you had an infrastructure, you had a system, but you were solo when it came to practicing in your specialty. Everybody turned to you for cancer care.
Galveston is like 450 miles or so, and Houston about 400 miles. So those patients had to go a long way. We didn't send anybody to Dallas. Very few went to Dallas, and hardly anyone went to San Antonio at that time. So they were all sent to me. Now, obviously, a lot of these primary care physicians, they're good people, but they didn't feel comfortable with somebody with sepsis, okay? Or bleeding from low platelets, thrombocytopenia, or severe pain that they cannot control, A lot of doctors were afraid of giving morphine and all that, So I had to take care of all those patients. I learned it the hard way. And eventually you get more attuned to it, how to take care of them, what to do, not to do. Solo, but like if I had pathological fracture, I have to get orthopedist and all that. For cancer practice, yes, solo. I had to take care of my patients most of the time, especially chemotherapy patients.
You mentioned earlier that rural areas and large swaths of America rely on physicians who trained abroad. And how the current immigration situation poses a major threat to immigration to the United States. And I want to pick up on that because I think it's so important. You know, America was very lucky to get you. And
Thank
just to put this in perspective, you know, you grew up in faraway land from our perspective in what is now Bangladesh. You went to the medical school in the capital, Dakar, which is an extraordinary story as to how you got in. It was funny. I Googled it to see what the admission rate is now. And I don't even know if this is true, but I Googled it twice, and it's 0.0017%. Admission rate. I can't even imagine an admission that competitive. But the point is that it was a very big deal to get into this tip-top medical school, and then a brutal training process. And getting the MBBS, I encourage people to read the story of the test that you had to go through to get the MBBS in those days. It makes ours look like a cakewalk. And then anyway, you come to the States. And by the way, I should also tell readers that although you were terrified that you would fail, because many, many people did, they would actually print results in the newspaper. And not only did you find out that you'd passed, but you found out that you were in the top 10. So anyway, I just want to read your arrival in the United States because it reminded me so much of the immigrant experience. And this is in 1968. And these were the days when you had to make multiple flight changes to get from India to New York. And you write, from London, Pan Am crossed the vast Atlantic and reached John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. My flight was delayed in London because of bad weather, and the city was dark and foggy when I left. As the plane arrived in New York, my mind must have been too occupied for me to look at the scene outside. But when I walked into the JFK lounge, I saw something through glass panels that transfixed me. Falling snowflakes. I looked around, and the sea of lights of the city revealed that whiteness had blanketed the entire ground. Growing up in a tropical country, I knew about snow only from books and pictures, but they conveyed nothing of the splendor I was viewing. I witnessed a different world in the crowded lounge. People of all colors and shapes spoke languages that I did not understand. A black porter had already checked my luggage tag. He was amiable and complained about the coming blizzard. I barely understood his thick accent, and I imagined he had the same problem with mine. This was the first time I had encountered an African American. Besides his color and accent, he was just like me. If the American whites considered him, quote, inferior, as I had read, would I be considered inferior too? And I should say, by the way, this is around midnight. So you're coming into this new land at midnight in the middle of a blizzard. And it turned out there was no one there to greet you. And so it's a very vivid experience that you describe of bewilderment into this new world amidst a beautiful but somewhat daunting blizzard. But I want to pick up on your last comment, would I be considered inferior too? Because that plays out at various times throughout your books. There is the several false starts where you think you're going to be hired for a job, and people are extremely impressed with what you can do. And then, of course, the board of the practice discovers that you're a dark-skinned man from a faraway land, and they're like, no thanks, not a good fit. And that happens a few times, and you seem to take it with a certain amount of good humor, although I know it was not easy at the time until you landed in San Angelo. And so I also recall you're describing how racism affected your patients at various times. I'm thinking of Juan Garcia, who is a patient who needed a CT-guided liver biopsy. And the doctor said, I think he's too high risk. This is a man with cirrhosis. And you commented that you had the experience that that's what he would say when you came to him with a patient who was Hispanic or Black. And again, to the various times where this emerges in your stories. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about racism in America at this time and as you experienced it.
That's a difficult question to answer. I remember that the tail end of the civil rights movement, 1969 I came, okay? It's a long time ago. It's 57 years ago. My own experience, because I was a doctor and then wherever I worked, I did my best. So I had good relations, but I also had small number of people that didn't care for me, no matter where, whether in Houston or New York or in San Angelo for that matter. I didn't let that bother me, partly because I felt like that I have to make my own life, my own career. So I need to circumvent those things. And I have circumvented some problem before too, so that probably helped in my mind. I'm no more tough than anyone else, and others have gone through worse than I have, because as a doctor I was more privileged, There were a small number of even attendings felt like that, I don't belong there. they automatically thought I probably, because of funny accent, this and that, I probably don't know much. I just got lucky to come here until I worked with them. And then most of them changed their mind once I interacted with them and worked with their patients. I was mentioning one in St. John's Hospital in Yonkers, New York. That's where I did my internship, first one, that Dr. Roche. In the beginning, I was feeling like that he really doesn't like me because he was giving me all these difficult patients to me, and I'll be off, but I still have to work because I cannot finish. Later, I realized that, he had a good heart. He really wants to make me learn as much as I can before I left the place as an intern. We did rotating internship those days. You could do straight or rotating. I took rotating. It was very difficult for foreign-born doctors to get a straight internship. You couldn't get it, internal medicine, surgery, this and that. But rotating it was easier. Easier means lesser than the other problem.
Fazlur, listening to you, I felt a little bit of shame because I was once a program director for 10 years, actually 11 years, back in the late, really in the aughts, at the turn of the millennium. And we were told, it was unspoken, but that you didn't want to be a, quote, IMG program, International Medical Graduate Program. And if you wanted to be kind of well-reputed as a residency program, you were supposed to be all American medical graduates. Now, there was some real irony here because, quite honestly, and this comes out in your story, those of you who made it into the American medical system were really the cream of the cream. For you to have gotten that position, I can't even imagine how good your board scores were. And I'm curious, in the days when you came, were these programs that took a lot of international medical graduates because they had a hard time recruiting American medical graduates?
Certainly it was in Queen's General. We saw Italian graduates and some of them Europeans and some Indians and a couple of Pakistanis. But they were foreign graduates, but that not necessarily they were brown skin like me.
Throughout your book, you touch on the issue of racism lightly. It's not something that ever ate you up with anger. But one story that I have to share because I thought it was so wonderful had to do with an evening where you and your wife went out for dinner, and this was in Texas. And you experienced a little bit of racism, and I just have to read this because it really shows so much about how Jahanara was not somebody you wanted to mess with, your wife. Jahanara was my love and my anchor. It's not that we did not have our differences, but I loved her deeply, and her presence made me forget all the troubles in my work. It's a mystery to me the way I was drawn to her. It wasn't just her beauty and youth. She, too, was making a life of her own, and she faced her challenges with determination. Once, in our early days in San Angelo, she and I went for dinner to a steakhouse in a remote part of town. The hostess kept us waiting while seating the white customers who came after us. After some time, the owner, a thick-accented German woman, herself came to us, looked at Jahanara and said, "We don't admit poorly dressed customers." Jahanara was beautifully dressed in a sari and being attractive was drawing appreciative glances. She replied, "I am better dressed than some of the half-naked women at your tables." She spoke up firmly. "Do you want me to point them out to you?" The owner quickly understood that this innocent-looking brown girl, Jahanara, girls in quotes, Jahanara looked younger than her age, meant what she had said, and hurriedly gave us a table.
And sometimes she was like that. If she felt like too much injustice, she would just stand up to it.
I would like to close with something you wrote. And you say, "The Temple Road, in my mind, conjures roads both real and metaphorical that I have traveled throughout my life." And then below that, you continue, "In the end, if I hadn't traveled the Temple Road of my boyhood, that exquisitely beautiful path with its lurking dangers, I wouldn't have had the chance to walk my metaphorical roads, and I wouldn't be where I am today. We all have our own temple roads to travel. It's my earnest wish that you will glean from these two interconnected books something to help you on your own path through life." I can't think of better words to conclude this discussion, and I would just ask you if there's anything you would like to add for our listeners.
One is that when you say a foreign-born doctor, you have to look at them that they made a lot of sacrifice to come here because they wanted a better life. But while they want a better life for them and for their children, they also want a better life for you, better health for you. That's why they dedicated here their practice and all that. And secondly, whether you like foreign-born person or not, look at the universities, look at the hospitals, without the foreign-born doctors, nurses, professors, deans, even presidents, we'll have a difficult time to run this country.
Well, thank you, Fazlur. Thank you for, at least for me, what was a beautiful reading experience. We've covered so few of the wonderful anecdotes and stories that play out in these two books, and we couldn't do justice to them here. And so I recommend them to our readers, and especially for your beautiful writing. So thank you so much, Fazlur.
I would like also the medical students especially to read this book on becoming a healer. Your book that came out 2022, published by Johns Hopkins. I read the book, actually. This is a good book, and it's not even a big book, so I think it's a good book. They should read it. I know you're recommending my book. It's not Return of that. If I didn't have me as a guest, I would still recommend it. I did to some people already.
Well, thank you, Fazlur. I'm here to recommend your book, but I won't turn down your recommending mine. Thank you.
Have a good day.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app, as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.